aqua friends. Today I have this beautiful snowy owl tutorial for you. I'm starting off with the background first, and I'm wetting everything really well so that we could work wet on wet. I didn't use too many different colors for this, so the palette is pretty simple. I actually just used whatever blue I had in my palette for the sky and the snow on the ground. So lightly putting that in, and I'm using neutral tint with some shadow green for the trees in the background. So my thought process for the branches is that I'm building up the colors of the dark area, the shadow area on the right hand side, and I'm going to do negative painting a lot to get the brush strokes for the pine trees. It actually turned out really pretty. So while it's still wet, I'm continuing to add the colors for the snow, some of the branches, the trees in the background. I am lifting a branch and some of the pine trees, just lifting that with my brush. So I let the paper dry a lot more, and taking a script liner brush, dipping it into clear water, and having this damp brush while your paper is still damp, you're kind of making controlled blooms in different shapes. So I am using it like I'm painting with paint, but I'm painting with water, and it's making these beautiful light brush strokes for the pine trees. After letting that dry, I'm coming in with a very watery mixture and coming over some of these pine branches, and I'm lightly putting in those branches to add more texture. So starting off with his head, I'm leaving the eyes and the beak, and I'm just getting the paper wet so that we could work wet on wet. With the same blue I used in the sky, I am putting in some of these shadows that I see that are on the cool side. Always starting from your lightest colors and building up. Doing the gray on the top of his head with a very watery mixture of neutral tint. So basically all I used was neutral tint, the shadow green, the blue, and I used Winsor lemon for his eyes. So very, very simple palette. So my paper is still wet, and I am bringing in the very light shadowy areas that are on the white part of his face. Going back up to the top of his head and putting another coat of the gray. And always painting in the direction that the fur goes. With tiny little brush strokes. So now I'm getting my midtones in, still painting in the direction that the fur goes. I'm building things up very slowly. It's a lot easier to build things up slowly. It might take more time, but it's harder to take paint off. So if you go too bold, too quick, things might become muddy and undefined. Coming in with the first layer around his eyes, getting those dark areas in. So really, you kind of clump the sections of feathers together and paint them that way so that you get the contrast that you need between these different layers. So that's how I'm going about painting him. I'm using a number 4 Black Velvet series brush to do these tiny little strokes. As I mentioned before, this brush has a very fine tip and it could almost replace a script liner brush if you have a very light hand. So I just keep working my way around his head. The eyes have dried. I could put my second layer to darken things and add more detail for the eyelashes and all the tiny little feathers that I'm putting in. Darkening up the other eye. So now I'm using the Winsor Lemon. It is a very nice cool yellow, and as you can see from the reference photo, I think it's a pretty perfect yellow to replicate his eyes. So while that dries, I'm wetting the body so that I could start working on the rest of his feathers. I'm starting off by putting in the shadows that I see with the same blue that I used in his face and in the background. My first layer of neutral tint. There's a couple of very light spots on his chest, so I'm trying to work around those to keep some of the white of the paper for contrast. So I'm working his body in the same manner as that I worked his head and breaking these shapes down into these different geometric areas. And always painting in the direction the feathers go. Putting the pupil in. So after that dries, I'm going back over those pupils, getting them a little bigger, a little darker. Such a tiny area, it's I'm trying to get it as circular as I can. And of course, also putting in that shadow above his eye on both sides with a very watery mixture of the neutral tint. Increasing the contrast, making the outline of his eye darker. Now I'm wetting his body again because he needs to be a lot darker. Coming in with that neutral tint. And I'm just following the outline that I've already made myself of where all these dark tones are gonna go. Softening things up, wetting the area. So now that I made his body darker, I have to go and wet the top of his head and put some more paint in there. Lightening up his top of his head a little bit, needs to match his body. Getting pretty close to being done with the gray. Adding in some more blue for the shadows on his wings. Adding some tiny little details of his feathers with my script liner brush. So now I'm switching to my opaque white watercolor, and this is the fun part of really bringing the white feathers to the foreground and really getting him nice and fluffy looking. So I'm just going around his face and getting those nice white strokes in and on his chest. And I'm bringing the white into the gray to kind of blend that out a lot better. See what a difference that made right there? Just that little wee bit. So doing the same thing with the underbelly part of his wing, feathering the white out into the gray so it blends a little better. Yeah, if you don't like something, you just take your paper towel and smudge it. That's what I do. So I just keep looking at the reference photo and adding in the lighter feathers on the gray. I want to soften the edges of the fur around his face, so I'm going in and adding a lot more feathers there. And that made quite a bit of difference. As you can see, it just looks a lot more fluffy now. And sign your painting and you're done. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial of this winter owl. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you next week.